Welcome back to Story Deep Dive with Dana and Rachel. We are coming in for our second conversation around The Whistleblower by Robert Peston.
Peston, nailed it.
Listen, when I listen back to our podcast episodes and I pause after every name, I was like, "Daggone it, Dana," but I can't help it. So we're going to be talking about this plot, but before we dive into talking about the plot and the whistleblower, what do you got going on over there, Rachel?
Yes, ma'am. So right now we are working on the second edition of the Complete Crime Writers Story Planner, the Complete Crime Writers Workbook. I can't remember the title of my own dang workbook. It's too many words and I always get stuck. So I had kind of an early bird launch at the end of December, and after giving the kind of the first, the early adopters and my early birds, giving them some time to spend a few months using it, I sent out a survey just a few weeks ago for them to kind of give me some of that feedback so I can fill in any gaps, make adjustments where, I've been doing this for quite a long time. And so it's possible that I'm overlooking things that in my mind are like, oh, that seems obvious, or like, right, that's not. And I've got probably about 20 writers using it, and sending out for that feedback. So I'm now in the process of collecting that feedback and making adjustments to the workbook to make it even better. So it's really exciting to kind of like be at this stage with the workbook and have it in the hands of writers and getting that feedback. And it's quite nice because when people say nice things, it makes me feel good. So that helps as well.
So how are you feeling about that feedback? Just hearing their experience with it.
Honestly, it's better than I even could have hoped for. Because, it's one of those things where you get really nervous. Because, like, when I made it, I was like, this is everything I know about crime writing that I've stuffed into this workbook. It's over 100 pages. We go through the 4-act structure. You've got suspects. You've got clues. You've got planning the murder. All of this stuff. And so I was really, really proud of it, but you never know how it lands until it lands or doesn't land. And so I was really nervous to get that feedback, but I've gotten so much positive feedback that, writers are experiencing like fresh perspective on how to work with their crime story. And even I got some feedback from some writers, like places where something wasn't working and they couldn't figure out why, and the workbook actually like generated one of those insights. So I'm really, and then I've been getting some good suggestions of just places where like maybe a little bit more clarity, or like, ooh, I would like more information about this thing. So it means that I can also add in just that little bit more and make it that little bit even better. But it's really, I couldn't be actually happier with the feedback I've been getting, which is great. Because I got that first survey back and I was like, oh my god. Like before I opened it, I was so nervous. So yeah, it's been really good.
I'm so excited for you. I think there's something about when you take on a project like that. On one hand, you want to tell everything, and then on the other hand, you have to constrain yourself because you want people to get the most from it. So then you are having to shift through what you know to try to figure out what is the absolute best, or not even always what's the best thing, but it's like what's going to get them through to the end to be able to say, this is complete and I can do this, and help them to build the skill set and then also their confidence to be able to execute on that. So I'm excited for you.
Thank you. I'm excited too. So, feeling good about that. What about you, Dana? What you got going on in there? I haven't talked to you in, I don't know, it seems like a couple of weeks. And I know that you can't tell me everything because this is like on the recorded podcast line, but I'm like, what's going on? I missed you. Where you been? It seems like you're busy over there.
First of all, it seems like a stretch of the truth that it's been 2 weeks. I don't know if it's been 2 weeks. I think you're exaggerating. However, it does feel like it. It has been so busy. So Everyone, if you have been here a while, you already know we record these out of order, and we record in advance because we are very busy. So our timeline sometimes is a little bit off. So if I am off, just charge it to my head, not my heart. With that said, at the beginning of the year, my coach, one of the things that we were talking about was to really get people into the flow of what students get in Danger Tales Writers, what they get in DTW, which is we do monthly workshops. They challenged me and us that are in this cohort, if you want to call it that, to give workshops monthly. And on one hand, I was already doing that because we do a monthly workshop, but there's something different to do something when it's public facing than when it's just in-house. That's the way it feels. Like you have to get a landing page, and that means every month I'm doing a sales page, and every month listen.
Those landing pages, man, the bane of your existence is the landing page.
Because you know what? If it was left up to Dana, I would say you could get it or you can't. You don't have to. Listen. You would think I don't sell well either, but I really do a good job. But the point is, so that has been very interesting, but above the exercise of doing it, it's really challenged me in how I'm thinking about what I want to share. Because if I was just sharing it in-house, then it could be an iteration on things. But if I'm sharing it in the public, then I have to think about, well, what do I want to share and what will, introduce the community, but also be beneficial to my students, and really just having this almost a tiered approach where it's like my students and then our guests, right? And so it has been a really great experience, and then not just strategizing and then executing and then coming out of it and getting the record. Like it's a song and dance. It's a song and dance, and it feels like, who signs us up for this? But I will say, as we prepare to come into we're about to go into our fourth one. And now it's getting easier and easier, and having the ideas are already there. And I'm seeing more and more students that I'm unfamiliar with participate. So it's going good, and it was a great challenge. But for those first couple of months, I was like, wait a minute. And then trying to balance between what I would consider like craft and then more technical stuff. Like we did, doing a custom GPT, how for novelists, and then, coming up, I don't know if it'll probably be passed by the time this recording goes up, but how to turn, I called it write once, market forever, and how you can turn your book content into social media content.
Oh, come on. I know every writer is like, oh, help me. Listen, social media, I feel like it's everybody's like Achilles heel of just like, oh no, not that. Like, I'm sure you're changing lives over there. Oh my God.
No, and I can't help you with if you just don't want to do it. I don't have nothing to do with that. However, if it's that you don't know what to put, I'm going to help you. So it's been good. And it's been really great to see how students inside the program it's just, so at the end of the day, the hard work is for good reason, but your girl is tired.
Yeah.
Getting tired. But
it's those landing pages.
But listen, who got it down? I said by the time this is done, I won't be scared no more. I'm gonna be able to write the landing page in my sleep. And if I don't, I'm just recording a video.
As tired as you are.
Listen. Oh my gosh. So yeah, so that's what we're working on, rolling with our workshops, and just by the time this comes up, we'll be in the second quarter, and the year is just rolling. Where did it go?
Oh no. I didn't think about the fact that this is going to be that it's the second quarter. And send help. I'm not, oh no.
You have no choice. You will be present and accounted for. So therefore, so it's just, yeah. And I think at the end of it all, doing things and still ensuring that you're, like, for me, that I'm doing it in a way that feels good and that I'm enjoying it and that they are getting something from it. And so, yeah, it's been really, I'm growing a lot in both content creation, teaching and instructing, and then also keeping my eyes on the bigger thing, because you can get lost in the sauce if you are focused on like the little week to week things of like making sure I hold that vision for the overarching. And so, yeah, that's where I've been hiding.
All right. Well, welcome back then today for the for some podcasting. You're going to be stuck with me for like 6 hours, so I'll get my fill, and I'm sure you'll get yours.
And then some. So with that said, y'all, we are going to get into the Whistleblower. Today we are talking about plot, and Rachel is going to dive in with the summary before we get into the meat and potatoes. So Rachel?
Yes. So when his estranged sister, Claire, is killed in a bike accident, journalist Gil Peck begins to investigate the secrets she left behind and the powerful players in the government she worked for during a major election in 1997. Peston brings to bear his expertise as a political journalist to fabricate scandals, conspiracies, and seamlessly integrate them with Gil's emotional arc, attaching us to Gil despite his flaws and getting us as committed to the truth as Gil is.
That's a great summary. I'm all like,
I wanted to keep it nice and and vague, particularly because since we're in crime, to just give you the like almost not much more than what's in like the blurb for the book, because there's so much. Almost like there's so much to unpack in the book of like the conflict of the book. If you try to get any more specific, it's not going to make sense out of context, which, so because this is, and we'll have talked about this in the preview, but this is British politics. So it's really high context.
Oh, God. Listen. Okay. So, and I'm sure I would have said it in the intro. This book, okay, listen.
These Rachel picks are gonna do us in.
I'm sure, because we record these out of order. I'm sure I've told y'all about my struggle bus. So just in case I slip into that again, you already know. So before we get into the details that we have and the things that we know we want to discuss, are there some key things that you want to ensure that we talk about when it comes to the plot? For the Whistleblower?
Yeah, so I definitely want to make sure that, because, excuse me, this novel has all of your crime writing essentials. So I definitely want to make sure that we talk a little bit about some of the features of crime that this book really showcases. And I also want to make sure that we talk a little bit about this kind of connects to the two, but you have a complicated kind of conspiracy style crime story. And so I want to at least touch on how you use layers of information to sort of achieve a conspiracy. And then I'll want to talk, just at least make a note about sort of like how to write investigative scenes in a way that kind of keeps the story moving effectively. And then lastly, only to touch on, because this is going to really lead into the characters episode, so I think it's like a good note to end on, is talking about how to write a more emotionally resonant crime story. So this won't necessarily apply to all crime writers, because some crime writers are writing more series fiction and they want to keep it kind of straightforward, puzzle, mystery. But for anyone looking to sort of layer in a little bit more emotional depth, this one is another good one to look at.
When it comes to all of those, I'm going to be just like adding in my 2 cents. I think those are great places. And a couple of them, I can't wait to hear what your notes are around it, being that this is not my jam. I enjoyed the story towards the end. And I'll say why. But it also helped me to articulate, even for myself, what the elements were that felt like a disconnect for me, and not because I don't like, because I will read thrillers, but I think some of the reasons are the reasons why people would read him. and I'm just not the audience. And but I found that he did some things really, really well, and there was some elements that I could even see with working with people who are doing something like dark romance, or even if you're doing epic fantasy where you're building a world where you could learn a lot when it comes to the layering, and really almost like the, what do you call it with those dolls that sort of, you take one out and it's
The
another
Russian
one you
nesting
take.
dolls.
There we go. That's what I felt like this really did, and it did well. And so with that said, you talked about, you wanted to talk about the layers, investigative scenes, emotional resonance. So I guess in general, let's start off with talking about the elements of a crime story that we'll find here. And I want to say a caveat to this, and this may be a caveat just to me, because I know you can go deep, deep. So I want to just put it on the table. The part of this is like, you don't, as someone listening to this, have to have read this story. But I do think that if you haven't read the story and you're listening to this and something resonates, that hopefully it will help you to lean into it and go ahead and take the next step and actually read the story. If you're someone who's on the fence and you're unsure, then listening to the different elements that you find in here, that you find that they do, or he or she, in this case, he did well, will make you think, oh, I wouldn't have thought about that story, but now I will. And so we're looking at it in multiple ways, but I really like seeing it through your lens, because this is like a seminal book for you when it comes to your clients and writing these sorts of books, and it is a masterwork for you. And so with that said, let's talk about the crime writing elements that are front and center in the Whistleblower.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you're writing a crime story, one of the first things that you kind of want to know is what your protagonist does for a living, which sounds like such an arbitrary, like it sounds like such a random, arbitrary thing. Excuse me, I got a little froggy voice this morning. But in a crime story, your protagonist's job is actually going to directly affect the investigation. And it's going to affect the concerns of the investigation. Because this is crime, because we usually are investigating a murder of some kind, what your protagonist does for a living is going to affect how they actually do that investigation. So if you have a police officer who's your protagonist, they're going to be worried about stuff like evidence being admissible in court. They're going to worry about following procedure and what happens to a case if you don't follow procedure. If you have a lawyer, right, they're coming from the perspective of what's going to hold up in court, what's going to get thrown out by a judge, right? All of these. So what the way that the protagonist is investigating, the kinds of opportunities that they have, and the kinds of obstacles they face is going to be, at least in part, related to what they do for a living. And I think that that's an overlooked area where crime writers can really find interesting conflict and add, add more conflict and add, I want to say something fresh, and I don't think something fresh is really the phrase that I'm looking for, but really lean into your unique story. So in this case, right, go ahead.
I want to say one of the words that I would use in those situations is where you start having inherent conflict, right? So if you are taking that lens and you are using that in your favor, then what happens is you don't have to go searching and making up things. You can find the conflict that is embedded in the fact that they are a cop or they are a detective. I would also add to that having this consideration up front also helps a lot if you're unsure the type of crime story that you want to tell, right? Because sometimes people always think, oh, I don't want to do anything that's procedural or whatever. Well, then maybe you look at, come at it through the lens of who is my protagonist and what do they do? Because that will affect how they process that and how to go through the process of investigating, which makes total sense.
Yeah, thank you. That's really what I'm looking for. It's like it allows you to lean into the inherent conflict, which is going to make your story more interesting. It's going to give it that additional layer of intrigue and interest and drive for the reader, right? So, like in the case of this story, Gil is a political journalist. And so as a journalist, he has unique concerns, opportunities, and obstacles. So the politics of journalism, right? His editor or the guy in charge of the paper, I can't remember his name, but being able to tell him, you're not writing that story, you're not publishing that story, right? Like the position that puts Gil in, and the amount of conflict that adds to his investigation. He also has to worry about the reliability of the people that he talks to, and like libel lawsuits is a thing that is a problem that he has to bump up against when he's wanting to expose the truth through a story. And it also creates the opportunities of the kinds of people he already knows and what he knows about the environment as a journalist. And it also means that the people that he talks to have reasons to either want to talk to him or definitely not talk to him, right? And so that, again, brings some of that inherent conflict to the story simply by virtue of the kind of job that Gil does. And so that's why I wanted to highlight that, because it's often an overlooked part of your crime story is like what your protagonist does. So if they're not a police officer, if they're like an amateur sleuth, they're going to have to find some workarounds in their engagement with the police to get the information they need, because they're not actually in a position of authority to be able to like get people to talk to them or do any, right? So they're kind of starting on their back foot because they don't have any authority necessarily. So that's thing number one. Yeah. I'm going to pause there.
Well, yeah, and I think when you say it that way, it makes me think about how whenever you're writing a story and you're starting to plot and you start looking at the moments when certain things happen, depending on how you plot, right, of whether you are looking for opportunities or those opportunities are there and you want to make sure that you are layering them appropriately. But I think even in this case of this story, a lot of the interactions and his engagements, whether they were there to throw him off or to move the needle, was so tainted by who he was and what he did. Because people had reasons, again, like you said, to either want to talk or not talk. I kept saying, like, he keeps having to operate in this gray space. And that gray space sometimes was the lack of information. Sometimes it was the lack of knowing whether people were being truthful or whether you are just politicking me, right? Or, and because his role, his job was to almost like see what isn't there, to be able to know whether his hunch was correct. That was also played. And then the final thing is all of that here was tainted by grief, right? And so that he's still trying to do a thing that he's done for many years, that he's efficient at, that he's known for doing. And the Robert, Mr. Peston, chose to do it through that lens of the fact that he's also doing it while in grief. And there's so many moments where people even kind of said it, and even at times he would say it, of like, okay, is it my grief that's doing this, or am I really seeing what I see? And plus a little bit of his isms. How he feels about germs and how he feels about his stuff being in a certain way. So yeah. So we have the first one of being his profession. In this case, he was investigative reporter, which colored everything. And I think the last part of it, of course, and that is the fact of him being an investigative reporter and the timing of this story, with the fact that I think about, I don't know, a third of the way or so in, it was really clear that it's almost like Super Bowl season for them. That it's that time where people are trying to get on their calendars and share information with them. And he's also wrestling with the investigation and also coming to terms with what's happening. So Great, 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 great thing. I don't know if I've ever would have thought about it that way, but I will now. Okay.
I want to just make a note because I think you also highlighted something that, again, is a great consideration for honestly any writer writing any kind of story. Is like, think about the timing of when your story is taking place, right? Like, this story takes place during a major general election. But I'm also thinking about, back to the things we never got over, right? This story takes place on the worst day of Naomi Witt's life. It opens on the worst day of her life, right? So when you're thinking about your story, even thinking about like when and where you set it, and how that can improve the story from a perspective of bring in more conflict. Like, as in, if it's kind of arbitrarily been decided, you can revisit that and ask yourself, like, is there actually like a better, like a time of year or a different year or whatever that could actually just add more of that squeeze and add more conflict, again, inherent conflict to the story, to just kick it up that extra notch. Because if this story were taking place 2 years, in the middle of a random year and there's not an election going on, it's not as explosive. The stakes aren't as high because it's not literally riding on an election, whether or not, like, the truth that Gil finds and the secrets that come out. In 2 years in politics, that's a lot of time for damage control or to change to change course or to pivot versus, there's an election in 8 months and we are in election season. And so I think also just thinking about when and where you've set your story and if that's, a contributing aspect of your story, and also using that as an opportunity to find more of that conflict.
Yeah, I totally agree. I always say, like, why this person and why now? And I think in this particular case, he needed it. Mr. Peston needed it because had he not had the timeline of the election, y'all, this thing would have been super slow. It would have been molasses slow. Okay. So
Mr. Peston, if you're listening, we love you.
Rachel, speak for yourself. I love this man.
Dana's like, I love you, Mr. Peston. We need to talk, okay?
Listen, she is not speaking for this part of the week. No, I don't say I don't like him. But I feel like he needed that. He needed that election. He needed that timeline. Also, he needed it because it also gave him access to the people because they needed him as much as he needed them. And he had to learn how to finesse his way into getting the information that he needed using the channels that were being open to him because it was an election season. And I think what that does too, it kind of makes me think about how you start thinking about, like, what are the details that you're adding to your story to sort of season it, right? Like, it's not always just beat, or scene. You need those, and you don't want to just have things just coming out of left field. But there are ways that you can, which you're going to talk about, like, add those layers. But I always like to, like, does it feel lived in? Does it feel well-rounded and whole and not just flat? And those are the things that contribute to it. And it also, those are the things that put everyone who is involved, whether they want to be or not, under a microscope.
Yeah.
Because of the subject matter and the time.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Absolutely. So some of the other things that this book has and that you're looking for in a crime story. So first of all, we of course have lots of suspects and characters that Gil needs to talk to, right? And we get this kind of colorful cast of characters who contribute to the world that Gil is inhabiting in a different way. And because, again, of Gil's history as a journalist, he knows who these people are, at the very least by reputation. So when we get introduced to them, we get Gil's perspective on what they contribute to this particular world. And I don't want to go too hard on that because we will go more into that during characters. But brought into contact with all these different people, and he's constantly in search of information. This is what drives a crime story. This is the narrative drive of a crime story, is the search for information. So in every scene, Gil is looking for information. So we open in a scene and we have a sense of whatever information Gil is trying to get, and then we watch him strategize to, and this is, now I'm kind of mixing points because now we're getting into like writing investigative scenes.
It's okay.
But we're watching him strategize to figure out what is the best way to try to get this information. And then we watch him sort of deploy that strategy and have to pivot throughout the scene based on the character he's interacting with. And by the end of the scene, we know whether he did or didn't get the information he's looking for. He always gets something, but it's not always what he's looking for. So by the end of the scene, he has some new kernel of information that is going to springboard us into the next scene and tell us what Gil needs to do next. And it kind of, so what it does is we kind of watch him pursue information, and then he either does or doesn't get that information. And that kind of is like what bounces us into the next scene, because again, it's one scene to the next of trying to get the information that he's looking for.
One of the things that I found so interesting in regards to that in this story is the fact that while he's doing that hopscotching, because if you're listening, you can't see Rachel's hands, right? Like you're bouncing from, from scene to scene to scene. While he's doing that hopscotching, you also have the thing that you're contending with, his professional pursuits. One of the things I write down is that he's always fighting his nature, right? And that involves his emotional arc and his growth arc, personally versus professionally. And also in most of the time at odds with the environment itself, right? Because what he wants to expose wants to be hidden.
Yeah.
And so what that does is, as he's going through in the pursuit of that information, it gives you that natural push-pull, and that goes to all the things that we talked about before, which helps that to happen in a little bit more of a natural way, if I want to say it that way. Yeah. Like it feels more natural versus forced or contrived. And you feel like, okay, you trying to, and that's what it didn't feel like. It did feel like it was a natural part of the circumstances.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important sort of aspect of what this book does and what this book does well, is that everything is really well integrated because everything touches on the key plot of the story, right? So Gil's transformation is being driven by the events of the story because they are directly bumping into, first of all, his relationship with his sister, as well as his relationship with his work. So it's giving us moments to see Gil wrestling with how he treats people in his work, and when he does or doesn't take a gamble on a hunch that he has, and it will go really right for him, and it'll go really wrong for him throughout the story. But the investigation itself is actually giving rise to those things. So when he thinks about his sister, right, because they're estranged, this is we're not getting sort of like weird one-off scenes that feel tangential of like, and here's a scene where Gil thinks about his sister to remind you that they were estranged and we should be sad, because I promise you, I've read those books where those scenes happen and they feel so boring and so unrelated, because what you have promised your reader in a case like this is a crime story. And so you have to weave your emotional resonance into the crime story and not treat it like a separate thread where you're like, and we have a few scenes where Gil thinks about stuff, And so what happens is, like, the events in the story are bringing back those recollections about his sister, and it's helping us to understand Gil as a character, which we need that, because Gil as a character he's a real trip, and this is we're going to talk about this in the characters episode. this is a great example of writing a deeply flawed protagonist and helping your reader to sort of sympathize with him, even if we kind of don't agree with him, even if it's like, man, I don't know about you, sir, but all of that is getting wrapped around the investigation that's happening. So the investigation is making those things relevant, which is keeping it all nice and tied into the story, which means you both have strong investigative scenes and strong emotional resonance as well within Gil, and as a way to show his transformation in the process of the investigation as well.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I did take away from, I know, like, that I enjoyed about this is I could not remember a time when I read a story like this where it was a reporter. I almost anytime that I do any type of thrillers or anything like that, they're almost always in some sort of law enforcement capacity. So therefore, a lot of those interactions and the progression and almost almost like the hiding. I just felt like everybody all had an angle, and it's almost like hold your purse and stand real still. Like, you don't know who is doing what, when, where, how, and it felt that way. Even to the point where as we moved through the story, like, even when I felt like he had downtime, I still didn't feel at ease. It just felt like,
don't do this.
Don't.
That's really crime writers. Dana's not into it, but that's what you want. You are still leaned forward. Oh man, it's so good.
I know that was a good thing, but for me, personal Dana, listen, I was over it. However, I could understand why we would want that here, and I think what it did also is it made it so that in his pursuit of those I'm about to say it wrong, in those moments of getting information, and then also in his moments of dealing with his grief, and in his moments of pursuing both his aspirations as a reporter at one of the busiest times of his career, and also at the end of the day looking for truth. We are sort of going through this process of his pacing. Robert, the author, the pacing did a wonderful job of never slowly letting off the gas. Like, it stayed a constant. And there are times where I felt like we were moving at the pace of molasses. But the great thing is it still felt progressive. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it then was like, I think this is just how he writes. It's a choice. I don't know if I would agree with the choice, but it was a choice, and I think it could have been easy. And the reason why I also feel like it was a choice was because he still knew how to make it progressive, and the stakes kept going up. They kept going up. At one point, and then I know we're going to get to your next thing. At one point, I think I wrote down something about the way the clues unfold bore me. That's what I said at first. And then later, I had to write it down just so my mind could try to chime in. But then later, I started realizing or at least what I believe. I think what I put here is like the combination of the clues was also this inherent understanding that this wasn't a single answer. It wasn't a single thing. Like, he was pursuing, trying to find out what happened in his sister's death. But the reality is, even in the beginning, that wasn't really the pursuit.
Yep.
Right? That wasn't the verse. So that means that we're also having an allowance for, and grace for, the fact that that there was the progression, and that and then I even put here that he did a great job of having like I called it 2 steps forward, 10 steps back, but the timeline thrusts them forward, right? And I think that as a writer, he did really, really well, because having that backtrack with this kind of pacing would have been an awful thing. It would have felt like you're almost like you're spiraling, but it didn't. And he did a great job of that.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. So you're absolutely right. Part of what makes this this story, like the mystery of this story, more complex is the fact that it's not just, and it doesn't even start with my sister died, who killed her. By the way, perfectly reasonable, rational start to a crime story. Many a crime story starts this way. Someone died, who did it? But the way that Peston sets this book up is, okay, my sister died, and she left behind some secrets. What was she looking into, right? So rather than just looking for who killed my sister, it is, wait a minute, like what is this thing that had her all worked up and all distressed that she was trying to fix, and then coincidentally or uncoincidentally dies around the same time, right? So already he opens up the question not of who killed her, but what was Claire hiding, or like what was Claire looking into? And it introduces us to the thread of not looking for a killer, but looking for what is going on with these taxes, with these, high profile players, and opens up this loop, which is going to bring us around to what is going on with what Claire was looking into, and then ultimately to like what happened with her death, like how did she die, like what actually happened. And so one of the ways that I think, one of the reasons that the pacing always felt like it was moving forward, and this is another one of your sort of like crime story essentials, is we have to, so in every scene, Gil is doing something to find information, but we'll also get these little bookends, right, at the start or end of a scene where it's sort of continuity stuff where it's like, the next day and Gil's getting ready to go do a thing. But while he's getting ready to go do that thing, he's reflecting on the information he already has and trying to put it together to formulate a theory. And these scenes, or these kind of snippets, are really important because they let you do some of that little like continuity stuff or add in some of that like reflective time for the protagonist, but in a way that feels like it's still moving us forward. You can't do it forever. You can't sit and spin your wheels all the time, but it's how you kind of remind the reader of important information, help them start synthesizing that information. And also, when the protagonist is having a theory, it's also how you can mislead your reader, because the protagonist's theory, the reader is going to adopt, because why wouldn't they, right? Because they're with the protagonist through the protagonist's lens, trying to synthesize that information. And that's one of the ways that you keep that pacing feeling like it's moving forward, even sort of off investigating time, is when, your protagonist is either talking to someone, trying to work out information, or within themselves, trying to, put information together into a cohesive theory. And that is how you kind of pull that off and keep it moving forward, even in the sort of like those short dips in between major investigative scenes.
I'm glad that you said that, and I feel like I need you to say that a bunch of times, because I know there's something else juicy, even better, but my brain is still trying to chew on it. And what I wrote that down as was deductive statements. Like, he was going through the process and he would just sort of like, it was like his understanding and how he made meaning of what he just found. And I really liked that, especially when the information started rolling in really fast. And again, he was operating at a deficit. He's operating in a gray area. And sometimes it was rolling in, and except for in certain conversations, I think his conversations with Jess always felt like it was, like they weren't trying to hide elements until he was. And we knew he was. But all the others always felt like you didn't know whether to trust it or not. And because I'm not really trusting like that, okay, I'm watching you. I had it all in my book. I don't trust her. I don't trust him. Look, I know something is happening right here. I don't know what it is, but I don't trust her. And I like that. And on one hand, it was frustrating. But the part that I like about it is the fact that what you just answered make a lot of sense, which is in doing it, it helps us to understand where that character is with the information. But it also can be done in a way to pull us forward, but it can also be done in a way to mislead. And having those moments and making sure that you have those moments can also, it almost is like a gathering of like, okay, here's where we are. Like when you are at the zoo, you are here.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so, yeah, so that's awesome. So we have, so you had a couple of other of the crime. So we had the investigation, the search or information. I love how you say sort of like formulating or having those, what I just was calling those deductive moments of what is going and how that can also affect the relationship between the protagonist and the reader. Also how it can affect the pacing and also how it can affect the progression of the crime. Would you call that something else of like the part where you are aiming to whether it's mislead or have red herrings as far as the writer is concerned? Would you call that something else? Does that have a different, or is
You
it
mean when
just,
you're talking about like deductive, when you're still working with like deductive statements?
yes. Mm-hmm.
I don't think of them as being differentiated. I think that that's something as a writer that you kind of will finesse in revision, especially, right? So like once you have the whole thing down, and you do, now I will say, crime writers, you do want your protagonist to have some theories and for those theories to be wrong. This is going to be a part of creating that pacing of, where your protagonist is following a line of thought and that line of thought is going to fall through on them. And that's especially going to hit you at major moments in the story, like your midpoint shift, where something major happens or changes in the case or upends the case. So I think of them as all under the same umbrella because they're probably going to be right on some things and just wrong about like one or two things, right? But it's those one or two things that are going to provide the key to the case. So I kind of class them all under the same category because they do kind of live together, in the way that the crime story is kind of unfolding, the way the protagonist is investigating, at least for me anyway.
Because essentially what's happening in those moments is like, it's never all wrong or all right, right? It's like in shades of gray. But if he's doing the reasoning and he's plucking the elements that he does know and then discerning why the elements that he had incorrect wasn't on point. Because even at one point, I just love when he says, wait a minute, I got distracted. He said, I forgot that blah, 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 blah was the center. I said, come on, Gil, right? That's what happened when you leave the whiskey wherever he had on the table. He's like,
You stopped me a Coke for 5 seconds.
Okay, listen, if that was, I said, this man
with his Coke habit.
Girl. And when he said, I just go run a line, is he talking? Girl, I'm talking to nobody but myself. Is he talking about? Yes, he was. Okay.
Yes.
But so having that, and I also would just venture to say that I bet it is something for people who are crime writers or want to be crime writers, that's also something that you have to grow in because it will also be like a stylistic choice of how you choose to tell stories. But I think it played really well in how he processed information and how he went about getting information. He had a very, clever way. And I can only imagine trying to stay true to the way that he sort of thought and positioned to get people to not even affirm it. They didn't even have to affirm it. They just had to not deny, like little stuff like that. And so that was almost just like a mental exercise in of itself. So we had the theories. Were there any other, because I want to make sure that you're also able to take us through the conversation about the layers and the the emotional resonance? Because I think you've talked about the investigative scenes. Was there more that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think moving into the layers, and I've already kind of like touched on the emotional crime story. We might just pop back on it really quickly, but I do want to hit those layers of information, because that's going to be one of your keys to a couple of things, especially if you're writing, like trying to write like a conspiracy style mystery, and also even just to improve your existing mystery to make it more twisty and more turny. And the way that you do this, one of the ways that you do this anyway, is using layers of information. So as we're going through the investigation, I want to say, your protagonist starts investigating and they get the first layer of information. This is just the stuff that's on the surface. This is them getting the basics of the case, the basics of the players, right? Any sort of easy information that they can get, right? This is happening at the beginning of the story. They're just getting, again, the basics. But then what you want to do is you want to start getting new layers of information, so what's happening is we are circling back, we are revisiting people and events and clues. So you get that first layer of information, and then you're going to get kind of like a break or a major insight in the case, and it's going to lead you to revisit. It doesn't have to, not every single clue, not every single person we're going to like have to revisit all the same people a dozen times over, but something is going to trigger your protagonist to say, wait a minute, there's more here. And then they go and they revisit a certain piece of information and they go a layer deeper. And then they kind of move, and that transitions them into that second layer of information. And then, right, and because the way a mystery works, one piece of information leads to the next. So they start following this trail. Now they're on this second layer where things are getting a little deeper, a little more complex, you're just past the surface. And then they'll get another insight, right, that's going to lead them to that third layer where it's like, now we're really getting to the meat of what's actually going on here. So what you're doing is having them, they're kind of almost moving in like a spiral, if we say spiral downward in terms of like layers of information and depth of information. And that's how you can make your mystery that little bit twistier, that little bit turnier, because what's happening is they're getting information, but the information that they get initially isn't everything. It's a start, but they're going to need to come back around it to understand it more fully and understand it more deeply. And that's going to be required to getting to the truth of the case. So that's when you think about information almost in layers, can also help you think about pacing your story, because it's like, okay, well, what are the first things that they can do in their investigation to get the landscape, to get the lay of the land for this case? Well, what do they need to do then to get one step like deeper into that information to get closer to the truth? And that's going to help you almost like even with, transitioning between acts or escalating your stakes, because they're getting closer and closer to the truth. So the conflict is rising and the tension is escalating and the screws are kind of getting tightened both on the protagonist and the people that the protagonist is making uncomfortable with their questions. So because one last just side note, you want multiple characters to be hiding something. Even the characters who aren't the killer, they should have secrets that they are trying to protect, which is going to complicate the protagonist's pursuit of the truth. Because now you have people lying to the protagonist, and the protagonist it's either going to, send them off, send them in the wrong direction, or they don't have all the information. They're going to find out this person is lying, and it turns out they weren't lying because they killed anybody. They're lying for other reasons. But that's another way of adding those layers into your investigation. And that's how you create more of that twist and turn. And you really, really need that, especially if you're doing a conspiracy of pretty much any kind.
You know what? If you are not watching this on our YouTube channel, it sucks to be you. Because Rachel was explaining this with her hands. But I will say this. That makes total sense to me. And I think in my mind, it always makes me think of two concepts. One is the fact of reverse engineering, of like you understand at the end where you want to be, but usually you start with the thing that feels so obvious, but it's obvious and it's also not the answer. It's not wrong, but it's not the answer. Right. And so you're sort of going deeper, deeper. It's almost like you find a clue where you find several clues, but it's one that takes you a step deeper. You find several elements that takes another one that takes you even deeper. And then the other element that it makes me think of or concept is like the five whys concept of, you ask five whys and you get to the root of the conflict or the root of, and in this case, it's sort of like, well, what happened and why? And by the time you get here, nothing was as obvious as it seemed, or nothing was as it seemed, but the elements that they did see were truths. It just wasn't for the reason or that they thought. And what to me this makes me really, really think that if you are writing this type of a story, or if you're someone here and you don't do thrillers or you don't do an investigative thriller, but you write suspense, I think it's about like not just going with the obvious, but allowing yourself to have the exploration of those whys and letting those whys be connected to something other than you just decided that that's what it is.
Yeah.
Right. Like the more that you allow those whys to be connected to someone else's truth or someone else's secret or someone else's shame or whatever it is you want, it not only makes it so that the line that you are exploring becomes more substantial, but it makes everything else around that investigation feel more real. Because nothing is ever in isolation. Nothing.
Yeah.
And I think in this story, like everything has something to do with everything. It was a million people and all of them had first and last names. I was like, listen.
Does anybody here have a nickname? Somebody? Do we call him Spike? Do we call him Champ? What? Anybody, please.
Listen, I just want to hold on to something. And listen, when you start saying, I understand what's going on. I know something's going on here. I just don't know what. I want you to talk about something else because I have a question for you around that. Because I really was asking myself, what is it about this story that is getting me? But the point of this all is the fact of you went from having theories, but then having the layers. And I think for me, that was really helpful of talking about those layers and also how that would tie really a lot into those investigative scenes, right? Of what do you want those scenes to reveal and where are we at in the process of that layer?
Yep.
Is he still on the surface because he won't allow himself to go to the depths that, well, maybe this isn't what I think it is? Or are you still holding on tight to your theory? Or are you at the point where it's obvious, I don't know what's going on, and you would let the circumstances or the information that you know become the basis of those theories versus the theories that you wanted them to be? And I think there was a nice, healthy play of that in this story. I think we did talking about emotional resonance, but was there any other elements? Because we did say like this story is colored in or tainted by grief, and not just grief. I found it very helpful too that the grief was something that happened to him, but because of his sister's death, but also the layer with their interaction and engagement with their parents and their father and the expectations of that. And so I think that's something that was really his journey. Him solving that, what happened to his sister, yes, and him having to deal with her passing. And even someone in the story was like, that it's something that happens, right? But I think him processing who he was, what he did against the landscape of the way the type of relationship that they had with their parents, and also the type of relationship that he had with his sister before they came estranged, and what the root cause of that was. I thought that made it so he felt more approachable, even though in some instances I felt like, and maybe we will bring this up when we talk about characters, that I felt like it wasn't as clear to me in the way that Preston wrote it, that it didn't feel that there was a clear consistency for me always in his character.
Yeah.
And just in how he wrote him. Like, I felt like sometimes he felt a little more quirky, and then sometimes he felt like he was that guy, he just didn't know he was that guy. And then sometimes he felt, and it just felt like that part wasn't consistent. And I don't know if it's just because he was trying to pull us into the story, and it's almost like when somebody has a fake accent and then they start really talking and then they forget. That's how I felt with him and that quirkiness. And then every once in a while, then he was like, oh, I had to wash my hands a bunch of times. I'm like, okay. Or I said 3 times, and I'm like, okay, is that all the time? Or is that sometimes? Or is it a moment of stress? Or anyways, yeah, I'm sorry, I went on a tangent. I think I had a squirrel moment. But the point of that is, I think we did see that his emotional growth, and it also allowed us to connect with him, even if we may not have agreed or understood in how he handled the world in general. Because he was almost like an opportunist. I don't know if that's the right word. Is this way? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I was just like, he's a work of something. And
Fascinating protagonist, honestly. And I think that, like, and we'll definitely talk more about this in the character episode, but you're watching someone who has accepted and allowed themselves to be a certain type of person and have to start questioning how much they like or want to continue being that person. And that means that Gil is kind of a weird person to be around, because he really comes off badly. But then you're also watching him kind of wrestle with that and try to figure out, who do I actually want to be? And he's going to keep asking that question throughout the entire story of, like, do I want to be that guy? And so this is kind of a nice connecting point to just, like, touch briefly on, writing an emotional crime story. I think this one is a great one to read for that, because, and I said this earlier in the episode, but not all crime stories are going to be deeply emotional, and they don't necessarily have to be. So there's loads of crime kind of serials that are just, we're looking for a killer and we're solving a puzzle, and our protagonist is kind of generally steady. Maybe they grow a little teensy bit, every book, and I mean, like, just very, very little over the course of a long running series. But not all crime novels are going to be emotionally resonant, or deeply emotional. But I do think that layering in some emotional resonance can make the difference between a crime story that readers remember and one that's just sort of, I don't want to give any specific examples, because that's going to sound like I'm, like, throwing shade. But, it's like Police Detective number 257, and it's just sort of like, they read it and it was fun, and then now it's over, and it doesn't stick. But adding in that emotional layer can really turn a crime story into one that avid crime readers really remember. And so this is a great example of that, because of how deeply personal this case is, and because of how much it forces a protagonist to confront his flaws as well. And in connection with those flaws is his relationships to important people in his life. So his brother-in-law, his parents, right? And this is what kind of gives rise to making that emotional aspect of the story relevant to the investigation, so that it fits into the investigation. It feels like a part of the whole story, rather than, like, we have an investigation, and then over here's here's the emotional arc over here. Like, and it's, again, it's that tangential stuff that your readers will kind of glaze over because it doesn't feel relevant. So that's, that can make the difference, right, between a good crime story, a fine crime story, and one that's really memorable.
Yeah, and in this story, I feel like he did an amazing job of that. I love the thought of the fact that it is integrated, that there were so many elements. I mean, like at the oddest moment, and it felt like a natural response. He would see something and have a memory of him and his sister when they were kids, and I felt that felt real. Right? Because you don't ask for the memory to pop up. You don't think, in his case, you don't even want it to pop up because he can't control the tear ducts, right? And I think what that did is that also humanized him. And when you have these moments where I know we won't get into this because there's two things I want to talk about, and hopefully this will be a bridge. I feel like there were moments in the story where it felt a little off-putting for me as a reader, just because it felt like the very thing that he was trying to bring down was the thing that he actually was. And so it wasn't until like I had to literally stop and just write out what made me frustrated about it. And I was like, oh, that may be part of the theme, right? Of this thing that he sees himself on the outside of it because in his mind, he's in pursuit of truth, or he is trying to find the answers for the people. But you are, in fact, part of the problem.
Yep.
And they are no different than you, but you think they're different because they're doing it for money and you're doing it for a promotion or prestige. It's all the same thing. And once that clicked, I was like, okay, now I can kind of get this a little bit better. Because at first I was like, dude, that's like when people are like rich people problems. Dude, okay, are you not? Hard pause. Stop, take a look in the mirror. And he was like, no, I'm not looking in the mirror because I'm making sure my stuff is straight. But it took me realizing that I was like, okay, I'm starting to get it. And also how he's having to wrestle with even at times saying, is that what, almost having a pause like, wait, is that what I'm thinking? Like, I didn't even realize I was saying it, but this is what I said. Or having those weird moments where he really should be in the moment and get to the answer that he's seeking, but someone sort of strokes his back a little bit and he loses himself. He's like, oh, dude, like stay focused. Your focus needs more focus, like a Karate Kid. And so I think like but it made him to be someone that was very interesting and unlike anyone that you've ever encountered, at least for me in a book and in a protagonist. And so there was that. With that said, it made me have a question for you. When you think about these types of stories, since for you, this is it's a great book, and I understand why. What is the promise? Right? What is the promise that a story like this is conveying to readers? Because I think that is a huge, that really has to be crystal clear and a North Star in the process of a story like this. Because if you don't know, it could probably get very muddy really quick, especially with this type of story that had a lot in details about the crime, details of who was involved, the layering of the political system. And then for someone who is in the U.S. and our political makeup is different. And then also the fact that the languaging things and then the formatting things of quotations and all that through my brain. Right. So understanding what that promise is so that you can be clear in your delivery would be crucial. So what would you say that promise is?
Yeah, so a couple of maybe like caveats that may be helpful here. So this was a book published by a British press. So I think the reason that we can't get ebooks or audiobooks of it is because I'm not even sure that a publisher in the US has bought this book to publish in the US, right? So already there is, and this is the tricky part about having access to Amazon. Amazon means I can get books from anywhere, but those books might not have been published for an audience like me. So because the thing is that, so Robert Peston is a pretty well-known, renowned British political journalist. And so I think already the promise of this fiction is Peston as a political journalist, an expert in this field, creating a work of fiction. Now I'm going to get to what you're kind of setting your reader up for, but I want to clarify that point because I don't think we were the intended audience.
No, I wasn't. I know I was.
So us, doing this book and getting our hands on this book is more of a fluke than your average British audience who this book was intended for.
Or if your best friend just happens to be a real story nerd and you are just... I am. But on these kind of books, I'm a for play one because listen...
Yes, I am sure that the publisher, possibly even Robert Peston himself, was like, "Who? I'm sorry, what? No, not no, ew, no, not for you."
But I think we're doing it justice. Okay, I think we're doing a good job.
I feel quite good about this very small American audience of two people tackling this book for public consumption on a podcast. But I do think it's an important clarification because, if you're writing a story about the American government for the American people, that is going to naturally mean that you have some people who have a lot of understanding and people who have a little understanding, and so you have to orient yourself. So I think that if you were a British reader, this book probably has enough you have enough background to understand the gist, and then this is kind of giving you an inside look at a little bit more of the mechanic. Yeah. And so he explains to the extent that I think a typical British audience needs more understanding of how it actually works. So for example, when he goes to I don't remember what they're called, but they're the events where the Parliament issues a statement for the press specifically, and the press gathers to hear it, and he kind of explains to you here's what's actually going on, here's what this means, here's why this happens, because that's something that I think a typical British audience they'd have enough background to know the basics, but then wouldn't know those specifics. So when you're writing a book like this, I think the promise is right up front of political conspiracy. What that also means is technical, a little bit technical, right? A little bit in the weeds. And so if you're into it, come on in. If you're not, maybe just not the one for you, right? But I say that as in so when you're crafting a book like this, understanding who you're expecting to get their hands on it. So if you want to, again, write a political thriller about some facet of how the US government works, you're assuming a decent body of shared knowledge for your American audience, and then you're explaining to them the minutia of what they probably don't know about how this facet of government works. And I think it's important to be really clear about that in things like your blurb. What this story is going to focus on and where it's taking place, so that you don't get the 1-star review of someone thinking it's something else and getting, not getting what they were looking for, and so from the very beginning, chapter 1, you kind of get a sense for the tone of what this story is going to be and how it works and what it's going to be like. And I think that's important in your first chapter, right? To let us know what are we in for, which is why something like Ninth House, right, starts with the prologue of she is about to pass out from the pain. She has an infected wound. She's remembering someone's bone jutting out of their leg. And it's setting the tone and the expectation for here's the kind of story you're going to be in for, right? Because then we're going to transition over to, kind of Alex in working for Lethe. We're at the prognostication, but that prologue is important to set you up for like, okay, it's violent.
Yeah.
We got bones sticking out of bodies. Are you in? This is a great chance for you to opt out, right? If someone's like reading an Amazon preview, they can be like, whoop, nope, not for me. I'll see you later. But if it's your kind of book, you're like, what the hell? And you're into it, right? And that's why that first chapter is also important. And then again, the blurb and the even your covers, and this is something that you, Dana, are an expert in, to help establish the audience that you're writing for. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does. I think it's a perfect thing because even as I was reading, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm not the audience. However, I can appreciate what's happening, and I think here you see someone. If he would have done anything else, because that is what he's known for, you would have been like, wait, what?
Yeah, if he was writing like a steamy romance novel, and you're like, Mr. Peston, oh dear.
It kind of reminds me of when we had those, and I meant to read it and I didn't. I maybe need to put it on my list. When you had, I think that was those collaborations with James Patterson and like Bill Clinton, when they did like a thriller where it was in the White House, and bringing those two elements together in your mind, just saying those two names, you already had a sense of what you were going to get, and that's what they delivered. Here, I think not only was it that, but because of what he was known for, it actually gave it another level of complexity. And that can be a great thing for people where they're like, this is my jam. But then on the other hand, because I think the blurb itself was compelling, but I wasn't familiar with who he was. So I was at all kind of disadvantages. But I think it did a great job of, and this is something that I told you before we started recording, like, I just felt like at no point did I feel like, okay, I'm sitting back. Like, I didn't even trust the down times. Everybody was suspicious. And so, and to me, that just shows that that's a good crime story. Also that it's a good thriller. And the fact that there were layers, and he hid them well, and all of that was done well. And so with that said, as we get towards the end of this episode, speaking about the plot and the whistleblower, are there any final things that you want us to touch on that we have not talked about?
No, we hit all my notes. You let me wax poetic about like, here's what you need in a crime story, here's why this works, here's what it's supposed to look. So I think it's a good opportunity for us to wrap before I say even more stuff, because we have 3 more episodes, well, 2 from here left for everyone to listen to, 3 more for us to record.
Well, then one of the things that I probably will ask you before we close this out, if you are somebody, because we did not talk about this, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in our editor's take, but just the thing of like, this would be something that you would classify as a masterwork, that this story, and it's because of the plot, right? It's because of the plot, and it's because of the execution. And if you are someone that hears this, and you're a writer who hears this, and this is your type of jam, like, what are some of the things that you would say to that writer that take inspiration from this story, or it is challenged by this story, where it concerns writing a political thriller like The Whistleblower?
Yeah, so definitely, rely on those layers of information, right? Like, you want secrets and scandals. You want stuff that your protagonist over the course of the story is going to continue to like peel back layers and find, honestly, that it's worse than they thought. If you're doing political thriller and conspiracy, it's always worse than they even thought. So you want to really lean into scandals and conspiracies. And just like you said, Dana, you want them to touch each other in the story, right? Like, you want them to kind of weave into each other so that, people have information on each other, and they're hiding things, from each other, for each other. And so that everything is kind of, all those pieces are intersecting with each other to complexify the case. And then you really want your protagonist to work for those clues, right? So you want to show them strategizing in an effort to get the information that they need, right? Basically, clues in a crime story is just information. Information is just the clue. That's what it boils down to. Like, we think of clues sometimes. It's like, I got a footprint, I have a recording. And those things are also clues. But really, information is the name of the game when you're creating clues. And so make them work for it. So show them strategizing and trying to come up with a way to get the information they're looking for. And then let us see them trying to implement that strategy and then adapting based on whoever they're talking to, right? They're going to run into conflicts with individual people or individual plans that they've created, and then let us see them trying to like figure out how to pivot when they run into those inevitable conflicts. And then by the end of the scene, we want to know, did they get what they were after or not? And what does that mean, right? So in light of whether they did or didn't get it, what do they need to do next? And that's going to help keep your story, right? It's again, we're hopscotching. We're going through the investigation, and then by the end, it's giving us a springboard into the next scene. And so, so that I don't go too long on too many takeaways and too many things to think about, those are going to be my top 2+ sub points inside of those.
Well, there you have it. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Story Deep Dive. As we talked about the plot in The Whistleblower, y'all, this is only touching the surface. So if at any point you're like, oh, wow, there's more. Yes, but wait, there's more. Like an old school infomercial. So you definitely will want to get your hands on it so that you can dive deeper and continue to go with us on this journey as we continue our analysis and discussion of The Whistleblower by Robert Peston. And we will see you in the next episode. And as always, take care and happy writing.